We made a very particular decision at Pebble going to the 6-week release cadence for most features because we were trying to keep customer engagement. And the theory was that repeat customers, while we were early, repeat customers were going to be important as we went from the Pebble to the Pebble Steel to the Pebble Time. Certainly we needed to grow our market, but we didn't wanted to retain as many of those customers as we could because they were also our greatest evangelists.
We had a hard deadline because we invited developers from all over the world to come see the first beta, and we were just not ready. It was tough. And I remember that you joined in and the first thing you did wasn't hire a bunch of people. The first thing you did was sit down and write some code. And you took the tough assignments and you submitted your code for review, and you took the feedback with grace, which I think earned you a lot of credit with the team really, really quickly.
I give a lot of credit to Eric and the team that was there before I started. It was a brilliant move to look into that community for folks who were already passionate about the product. More than one case, they'd proven their technical chops by building amazing things on embedded platforms, some small form factor platforms. So, we were fortunate because I would say maybe a quarter, maybe a bit more of our hires were folks who got into the ecosystem because they were interested in building on those products.
Welcome to Coredump Sessions, the podcast for IoT leaders, firmware engineers, and embedded systems enthusiasts. Each episode, we bring you insights from the leaders and innovators shaping the future of connected devices. We'll talk about what's breaking, what's working, and what it really takes to build reliable products at scale. Let's jump in.
All right. Hi, everybody. Hi, Ken. Hi, Chris. Good to see you.
Good morning.
Happy Tuesday.
All right. Happy Tuesday, everyone. And I see some folks starting to come in. Wonderful. Oh, I see some known names in here. I see some ex-Pebble colleagues. Wonderful. Thank you for joining us. So hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Coredump live session with Chris and François. Today, we have a super interesting topic, a little bit different from what we do usually. We're talking about going from Pebble to Intel. Can hardware startups beat the big players? And we know they can, so we'll talk about how. We have an amazing new panelist today with Ken, who I will be introducing soon, my former boss at Pebble. For those tuning in live, thank you for being here. One of the benefits of joining live is that you can shape the conversation. We may wait until the end, but we will do our best to answer all of your questions. Today's session is part of an ongoing series, and every episode is available on all major podcast platforms. You can watch or listen to past sessions and subscribe at memfault.com/coredump-sessions. All right, so now onto our panelists. Today, I'm really excited to present Kean Wong. He's the CTO and co-founder of Eagor. Ken has spent his career working on the forefront of new consumer products, from PDAs and smartwatches to AR glasses, as well as AI. Ken is a veteran of Pebble, where he was the VP of software and my boss for several years, but also of Palm, Intel, and Facebook. He's led and built engineering teams ranging from rapid growth startups to large organizations with hundreds of engineers around the globe. He's the inventor on over 100 issued patents and the co-founder and CTO at Eagor, building consumer-focused AI products. Ken, it's such a delight to have you on the show and to talk to you again. Thank you for coming.
And thank you. It's great to be here, and it's always great to talk to old friends and make some new ones as well.
As always, my name is François Baldassari. I'm the founder and CEO at Memfault. I'm an embedded software engineer, and I'm way too passionate about tools and the way we build products. And I'm joined by Chris, my co-founder and CTO, who also worked with Ken and I at Pebble and is the brain behind the operation here at Memfault. Hi, Chris.
Hey, good to be here.
All right. So today, Ken, I think why I'm really excited to talk to you is that we've had a number of conversations about Pebble. Our audience seems to like it, but also we're personally passionate. They were some of the most exciting years of our career so far. And one of the things that dawned on me is that we continuously talked about Pebble from the engineer's perspective. There are many decisions we made, things we did, bugs we fixed. But at the time, we were mostly focused on solving the technical problems in front of us. And I don't think we spent much time ever thinking about, was this a smart investment? What is the ROI of what we're doing? What is the strategy behind this engineering team? And we just took for granted that great people were joining the team, that good decisions were being made. And I think a lot of that was thanks to your great stewardship. So I was really glad that you agreed to join us so we could dig into that side of the fence with the benefit of hindsight. So get ready, and we're going to touch on hiring. We're going to touch on investments in infrastructure versus product development. We're going to talk about product velocity, security, and many other things. Okay, so first, to set the stage for those of you listening, Ken, Chris, and I worked together at Pebble from 2014 to 2016, maybe late 2013 to 2016, right?
13 to 16, yeah, 3 years.
2013 to 2016, so 3 years. When we joined, Pebble had shipped its first product, the Pebble Watch. And so the Pebble Watch was a Kickstarter. It had a e-paper display. It was one of the first smartwatches on the market. And we were really starting to think about what comes next. We'd been, in a way, more successful than we thought we could be. We built this product. Lots of people loved it and used it. And we needed to now deliver on a roadmap and start building a team and a set of new products that would keep the business growing. So maybe first, Ken, you can tell us how it felt going from Facebook, where, large organization, all of a sudden started, and software company that made most of its money on advertising, to joining Pebble, a hardware company that was building, devices we sold for money. Was there anything, obviously you'd worked at a lot of hardware companies, but was there anything that surprised you? Anything that was different about Pebble that kind of hit you right in the face from the beginning?
I think as opposed to my previous experience, Pebble was really on the forefront of a new wave of low-cost sort of rapid development hardware projects. Previously working at Palm, where we were making PDAs, for those of you old enough to remember what that might mean, apart from infection. We were making phones and tablets. Those were multi-year projects. Very quickly, in development builds, we were building thousands of units. We were having to work with carriers, and so it was a very different environment. Going to a consumer-focused company that had a direct sales channel, very hacker and I think in a good way mindset of trying to get product out to consumers as fast as possible, and an extremely developer-focused orientation. And developers were, I don't know what the exact percentage was, but it was very large number of, especially early purchasers, were folks who were writing apps for the watch. It was probably some extremely high percentage at the start, and then we enabled things like watch faces where anybody could customize their product. So it was a very different environment. Actually, I'm not sure I ever told you this about how I ended up at Pebble, but the Pebble team decided actually to go to a big company, Facebook, that was in an adjacent market, and have a hackathon. And that's how I got introduced to Eric and the team there. And it was a really passionate team. It was easy to see that the folks working on the team were really excited about it. An opportunity for me personally.
I don't know if hackathons are still as successful or helpful as they were before, but my sense is that we actually did a lot of hiring from hackathons, developer events, or from community events rather than the traditional resume pipeline, right?
And I think that was, give a lot of credit to Eric and and the team that was there before I started. It was a brilliant move to look into that community for folks who were already passionate about the product. In more than one case, they'd proven their technical chops by building amazing things, on embedded platforms, some small form factor platforms. So, we were fortunate because there was I would say maybe a quarter, maybe a bit more of our hires were folks who got into the ecosystem because they were interested in building on those products. I don't think that's dissimilar. Thinking back actually to my days at Palm as well, there certainly were plenty of hires that came in there because they had written apps for the platform. So I think if you are it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. You don't necessarily want to hire all of the best developers. And in fact, I remember having those conversations at Pebble. But there is an amazing talent pool available if you happen to have an active developer community.
Chris, when Ken joined, do you remember what were the things you most wanted from an engineering leader? Because my memory is that before Ken joined, there was no engineering management. There was just a bunch of engineers running around like chickens with their head cut off. Did you have expectations of what you'd want an engineering leader to do? Do you remember?
Yeah, I guess that's a good question. It was very different for me coming to Pebble in the first place, because before that I'd been working on enterprise servers at Sun and Oracle, massive structure, things were in place. And I think something that really stood out to me in the hiring process and sort of when I first joined and talked to Ken throughout, that was kind of the transparency and kind of building a perspective of what's going on, across the business, what problems are being solved, what are different teams working on. And that's something that I've always found. I guess that's something I didn't even realize at the time, but I find extremely motivating is when you understand like what are the different challenges that are being tackled, what are the different problems that teams are working on, how can sort of what we're working on contribute to that. And so I guess like something that I really appreciated was that sharing of that perspective and building a real engineering culture. And that's what I look on a lot of that
I
time.
remember personally mostly not wanting things to change. My biggest reaction to Ken joining the team was, oh no, here comes a real, adult, because we were all young and had no idea what we were doing. And I thought the fun was going to end. And I really didn't spend enough time thinking about all the great things it would do for me and for the engineering overall. I was mostly focused on loss aversion and not wanting things to change.
You were there a little bit longer than me.
Right. That's right.
Remember
I had experienced the chaotic period and I found that I liked it.
My journey with Pebble started with a chat with François. He's like, have a casual conversation with my boss. He's a good guy to talk to. I talked to Ken and one thing.
Ken, when you joined, what were the top priorities? You joined, there was, a bunch of engineers, there was no real plan, there was no management whatsoever. So I imagine you immediately grabbed the fire extinguisher and started putting out fires. What were the top fires? What were the things you thought, okay, I need to get this going ASAP?
Well, I remember right when I joined, we were about to bring out, I can't remember if it was version 2 of the developer platform or version 1, but there was a major release happening. For better or worse, I ended up writing a bunch of code in various places across the platform. And so, actually, I think as far as trial by fire and the ability to, or the requirement to come in and have to rapidly learn, what the code base was like, who was doing what was neglected and needed some love, and what was already in great shape. That was a good opportunity to figure that out quickly. I certainly coming in, I'd say probably walking in the door, a 60% plan of where I saw the engineering organization in a couple of years. And I think probably by the end of the first week or two, I had a 90% idea. A lot of that I didn't share with everybody. Many of those things I did share with Eric, but if there are 100 steps to get there, then it would be disruptive, distracting, confusing to say to especially a small team that, as you said, had been somewhat chaotic at times. Okay, this is kind of where I think the organization can go. I remember saying this to various folks at the team. Big companies start out every big successful company started out as a small team of chaotic, activity, folks doing every single role, stepping in, helping each other. Whether they're old established companies or sort of new style companies, and also that's the goal for not all, but I'd say almost all small companies is to succeed. Not necessarily, big is a matter of scale, but is to succeed. And growing the scope, the number of people, number of customers means that your organization is going to change. So for those of you who were like me in small scrappy startups today with very few resources, we're a few nodes behind where Memfault is at the moment. Right, the goal is to get things hopefully a little more under control and be able to succeed in whatever you're doing. So there are some people who, in some companies who decide that they are happy at a particular size. Maybe they're companies, often they're companies where they've found a market and a lifestyle and a revenue stream that will keep everybody internally happy, and they just kind of stay static like that. But most companies and most individuals, enjoy kind of being on a growth path. And so I think that's actually a key thing for a company that's not already massive, is figuring out, what's a vision of success, however many months or years in the future? What's a realistic vision that doesn't, make unreal assumptions? And then what are all the steps you need to do to get from here to there? But you don't necessarily need to lay everything out because it may sound like a fantasy depending on, where you're coming from. It may sound really scary to other folks around you. Sometimes it takes a transition. It takes hiring people, training people, building infrastructure, proving to folks that things are possible to kind of bring them along in that journey.
Yeah, you must have a North Star, but you shouldn't be too attached to your 3-year plan at a startup, certainly.
You have to get there.
In any plan, once it's written down, it's going to change.
But a startup's purpose
should have goals.
Startup's purpose is to grow. I think that's really important. And if I was talking to my former self, I would tell them or myself that a startup's purpose is to grow, and therefore it must continuously change. Like being too attached to the way things feel or are on day one is a liability. And you should just embrace the change and lean into it, because growth is the prize and the purpose. I remember that first, you were right. We were shipping version 2.0. It was really hard. It was a really hard release to get out. We had a hard deadline because we invited developers from all over the world to come see the first beta, and we were just not ready. It was tough. And I remember that you joined in, and the first thing you did wasn't hire a bunch of people. The first thing you did was sit down and write some code. And you took the tough assignments and you submitted your code for review, and you took the feedback with grace, which I think earned you a lot of credit with the team really, really quickly. And I don't know if every engineering leader has that, that can go through that, whether they still have the skills or whether they might have other priorities. But I think that it felt from my perspective like a really nice way to get to know you, which was to work alongside you and get this big release out the door.
So actually, I think that the tools help these days. There's probably more opportunity in the last couple of years because of AI-based tools where someone who's even rusty, frankly, may not even know a particular language or platform can contribute something of some incremental value. So I'd say that that's probably more possible than people think. And diving in and understanding how the existing team works is critical especially before going and hiring folks and disrupting a system that is to some extent working.
One of the first things so once we got that release out the door, painful, but we did it. A very proud milestone for me. For those of you who are, Pebble enthusiasts, that's when we first built the sandbox so that applications written on the Pebble watch could no longer crash the watch, which was a nice quality of life improvement for our customers. The next thing that obviously changed is that you started hiring people, and that was a tall task. I think we went from 5 to 90 engineers over a period of maybe 2 years, right?
I think we peaked at about 100, including interns. I'd say 18 months or 2 years in.
Yeah, so we hired 100 people in 2 years. That's a lot of people. And at the beginning, there was one recruiter and there was you, right? And something that strikes me is that we had very low attrition. We hired really good people. I still feel like that was the best team that I had been a part of. And I think we did it relatively quickly. So how did you do that? Who did you look for? How did you balance velocity versus quality? What is your takeaway on? I think this was a relatively successful part of your tenure, right? Why was it so successful?
So I think partly because we had a pipeline because of developers of potential applicants that were part of the funnel. Learned a lot coming out of Facebook. It was still Facebook back then about structured hiring. Earlier in my career, I was at Palm for 11 years, starting out, in individual contributor roles and sort of moving up. And I remember even very late at Palm after being there 11 years, and it was a very established company. Their hiring process was messy, walking into interviews and, previous people had asked the same questions. I think so there were some things, and I'm happy to talk about sort of the basics, but with respect to hiring process and practice, where it's actually not a lot of work to put enough structure in to make sure that once we had a funnel, we were able to get what we thought were pretty good outcomes at the end and hire great people. We were very fortunate because, Eric and a lot of the team had come out of the University of Waterloo. And so we had a really good pipeline actually of interns that were coming in. And so I think especially looking at the market, so that also you need to understand what is the macro hiring market that you're in. We were actually in a very difficult market for quite a while because it was a very competitive market for hiring engineers in 2013 to 16. I'd say even in embedded, there were lots of big checks that were getting written out. We were competing against companies that had more resources and for some parts of the market had big mind share. It's very different today. There are lots and lots of amazing folks, whether they have industry experience, whether they're just graduating, who are out there today. So I think today would be a little bit more of a flipped problem of so many candidates and then figuring out how to narrow it. But I do think, so you've got the sort of top of funnel question. What is the macro environment like? What are the advantages or disadvantages you have as a company? And then how are you going to sort of manage your funnel to try and get folks who are appropriate for your organization, on board and actually post that being successful as new hire?
How did you find the diamonds in the rough? I think something that really strikes me when I think about the Pebble engineering team is that they weren't the obvious resumes. And of course, they were the community members that got you, you got community members and interns and they helped you with the top of funnel. But ultimately, many of those people were not appropriate for the role. I mean, we had many people writing Pebble apps who were not software engineers at all, even though they might apply because they loved Pebble, right? And somehow you found, you found people from all over the world who were working on very old legacy systems, might not have been obvious candidates for a fast-moving startup, and that somehow we identify as great talent and hired and brought to California and who ended up having amazing careers after Pebble, by the way. I'm not going to name any names to put anyone on the spot.
It feels different now too, right? Because at that time, like everyone moved to the office in California too, but these days, I feel like that was so impactful for building a culture and getting things in place. But these days, that would feel like a difficult element.
But actually, I'd push back on that because we have this large and very successful office in Waterloo. So there was always a sort of a remote practice. Some people actually work from home forever for the whole full times. I think part of it is sort of outreach. Part of it is understanding what risks. I mean, even thinking about some sort of the folks who come to mind as being traditional hires who worked out great at Pebble. Every single one of those was a risk assessment. We had to somehow find those folks. Again, some of them were in the community, some of them were in network. I think for better or worse, there's utility in reaching out to friends of friends, broadcasting wide. Hey, these are the types of people that we're looking for. This is the skill set we're looking for. I think don't be shy in harassing your friends and saying, hey, do you know anybody? And it may not even be a professional contact. Like it might be, they're still friends with someone from, middle school that they went to who happens to be, have the right skill set. Don't be shy, even if folks already have an existing gig. What you're able to offer them may be more exciting. You don't really know that the conditions around what they're working on currently, if you're really passionate about what they could bring to the table. And then, as I said, like risk, I think every single probably one of those folks who are coming to your mind, and frankly, some of the folks who didn't end up being great fits at Pebble were risks. Every hire is a risk. Some of them are more obvious than others. I think we had a process where we thought that we could characterize different types of risk in folks, and we explicitly took risks on whether it was hiring or even promoting folks into different roles, knowingly saying, we're not quite sure how this is going to turn out, but given our risk tolerance at the moment, given the overall priorities, we're willing to kind of see how this goes. That is different in different places and in certain geographies. California, where Pebble was based, again, for better or worse, the hiring practices mean that if someone doesn't turn out, then you can part ways relatively quickly. In other geographies, obviously, it's more of a commitment. And so I think figuring out what the risk tolerance is for the company at the time, because this can change, or for the organization, is really important. I always felt that if you have the flexibility, then try and take some of those risks. Some of them will not work out and you'll have to deal with the repercussions of that. Some of them will work out fantastically and your benefit, your reward will be 2x or 10x what you ever thought.
Three things that I remember from the hiring process was that number one, it was very systematic. So the questions, the interview structure was always very systematic. Number two is the hires were more or less unanimous. Like the hiring committee had to agree as a whole to make the hire. It wasn't just Ken decides. And then the last thing is that you had that screening question. Do you remember that screening question, Chris, that every engineering hire for every role went through? Chris, do you remember what it was? Counting ones in a matrix, right?
Yes,
it was like a
matrix
2D matrix. You've got to write a simple algorithm to count the ones or to count the zeros. I don't recall. That question, I think, was really strong signal, had really, really strong signal. Oftentimes, if someone really did well on that question, and that didn't mean being super clever. It meant a reasonable answer arrived at quickly and neatly. That bode really well for a hire.
I think a lot of this were things that I learned at Facebook, and I was only a little bit involved in the hiring process, but there was a lot of good things to learn there. Standardized questions, and I think we started off with a small suite of screening questions, and then we ended up with a few more as we were looking for more specialization at the time. But we specifically had questions that someone could answer in any language. Really the goal was, did you have mastery or fairly good strength in at least one language? Yes, we asked folks to, especially when we got to the coding questions, to answer them real time during an interview. But the approach that we took was, here is the question. I'm going to go away and do something for 15 or 20 minutes. I'm not going to look over your shoulder, code it up in whatever IDE or whatever platform that you're competent in, and come back and show me the results. And so I think interviews are such a weird artifice. They're not like how someone works in real life.
Right.
These days, I would say use whatever AI tool you want. You're trying to understand, can someone get to an outcome? Did they understand what they did? And actually, can they work with the relevant tools of the day? I think is even more important these days. Having someone stand on a whiteboard and try and code something is so far removed from what most people do most of the time. Yes, sometimes you need to do that in a collaborative or an explanatory fashion. But so I think you need to be able to assess multiple candidates, especially in an environment as it is today, where there are a lot of great people out there, and you're likely to get multiple folks at the end of the pipeline who look pretty good. So assess them against the same questions, as standardized as you can. Possibly, if you can, try and have the same person give the same question. Structured in a way, again, we intentionally went for questions early on that did not require you to know C. So we were looking for folks who had not even necessarily a specific skill set in embedded C programming, but who had approaches and methodologies and core understandings of basic principles, who could debug, who could think through challenges, who you could throw a pivot in there in the middle of the question and see how they react. So sort of general foundational understanding, which again, I think with the tools that are available today, we can talk about AI's impact on software development in a second, but are even more relevant. And then so even when we got out of the technical questions, but to the more behavioral type questions, is someone a fit? How do they think about software architecture and things like that? We tended to have the same people fill the same roles. We called them roles during interviews, so that as we had candidates, whether it's you have two in the pipeline who are great, or you're just comparing, here's someone we hired 6 months or 2 years ago, and I remember how they did at this question, and here's the new candidate. So really being able to repeat that process the same way you would do with test automation or something like that, running unit tests, right? You're looking for a structure, enough structure so that you can go through, you can reliably repeat the process and evaluate the changes, the new candidates against
I think that's a key insight. We hired a lot of early career software engineers who know how to write Java or Python, and we taught them firmware and we taught them embedded. And that worked really well for us. I think especially because we were trying to build a more software-y culture. I think it's a good segue onto like org chart to some extent. Something that I delight in digging into with VPs of engineering at our customers is the firmware team under their software organization or their hardware organization. And so at Pebble, it was under the software organization. because we really were trying to build that culture. Do you think there's a canonically right answer there, or how, would you think about structuring those teams?
I think it depends on the definition of firmware. So I guess I make a distinction between board level bring up and sort of hardware test firmware and manufacturing test firmware, as opposed to everything else that is customer facing. I think customer facing, to me, needs to be part of a consolidated software team, because there are very few features I can think of that don't end up being end to end in some respect, even if it's a purely embedded product that doesn't have connectivity, doesn't have a mobile app, right? Interfaces with a customer at some point. So whether you've got a mono repo or not, right? There's the electrons that are moving on the silicon eventually end up being in someone's eyeballs or someone's brain. So to me, having that sort of continuous path in having any siloing in any organization, unless you're working on something highly secretive, generally makes things really tough to work in, to be efficient, to communicate effectively well. I think we've seen some companies like Apple have very much a partition culture, and that has benefits and that has downsides. And I think looking at their current struggles with AI, most people would say that model sometimes really struggles. So I think for that reason, most of the time I'd say firmware should be as part of a centralized software organization. I think there is specialization in, it doesn't necessarily mean there's people have to be there full time, but depending on the company, maybe it makes sense in especially manufacturing support, going in and working with and integrating with the manufacturing systems they're working at large scale on production lines is a special thing, a specialist skill set. I know at Pebble, we sort of helicoptered folks in and out of that role, but
Right.
there is a learning curve. But other than that, I'd say integrate them.
Something
Go ahead.
I was thankful for. I was going to say it was something I was thankful for in my time there, because before that, the approach I had to hardware was all very, waterfall based. We're going to ship something every 2 years and then like come back to it in the future. And this whole software infused mindset, sort of iterating, let us move so much faster than I had experience moving at places before.
One of the things that I think was also special about the way the engineering team operated at Pebble is that we invested a lot in infrastructure. And as an engineer, I was always very excited about infrastructure. I mean, I even built a company building infrastructure. So I think I'm definitely at a far end of the scale. We built CI systems, automated testing. We had big data pipelines. I remember Treasure Data, and before that, Kean.io was a tool we used, RIP. From my perspective as an engineer, I love working on those tools. And I also love using those tools to spend less time debugging issues or trying to reproduce them. But from your perspective, how did you think about the ROI? Did you think this is something that was really smart? Did you think this was something that was fine? Did you think this was something that actually was a waste of time at times? Like, how did you, with the benefit of hindsight, how appropriate do you feel like our infrastructure investments were?
It was a huge investment. This was something that I can't remember how early on, but very early on, Eric and I discussed. I think it was probably 10 to 20% of total engineering effort, which is a huge amount. But if you look at what the flexibility that can gain you, but it really does depend on your business, the type of products you're making. We were making products and it also depends, frankly, on your revenue stream, the maintenance life cycle. I think even more so looking forward at the accelerating capabilities that AI can give you, with software engineers. Basically, if you look at especially at some of the systems like Cursor, where, or Claude's integration with GitHub now, where basically on the pure software side, you can spin up an environment, have it write a bunch of code for you and go away, and depending on the level of testing, iterate and test and come up with a solution that is hopefully correct. I think, think if you're able to bring that to hardware, which is essentially what we did. I remember when we were talking about our hiring plans, like one of the first things we would check is how many dev boards are available. I always pushed for, it imposed a lot of extra work on the hardware team, but to go and make a ridiculous number of development boards. And most organizations would be very reticent to do that because it does cost a lot of time and effort, but that really enables scalability in a lot of different ways, whether it's more physical hires, the ability to experiment more, basically also to enable folks to have more autonomy. You can allow someone who's newer to the organization to do something, to whether it's checking in code or running on a branch, and go and validate that against your automated test system, and they get feedback, you get feedback as to whether or not their code is good, it's safe to check in, if they've affected something very subtle from a power management perspective that you picked up because you had overnight, power management runs. So it gives the organization a lot of flexibility. It's definitely a sort of a structural decision, and it's kind of the same decision of similar to, okay, am I going to hire a small number of highly capable people and pay them more, or am I going to hire a larger team and sort of use the law of large numbers to try and catch all the issues before they go out? So you need to kind of decide philosophically what works for your existing team, what works for your business. If you're in the business of sort of doing rapid turnaround, single product, single platform type products, and you don't have sort of a longer term maintenance requirement, you may not have a developer community, then investing in that sort of infrastructure may not make sense for you.
API contracts, our API contract was something we took very seriously, and that
Yeah.
drove a lot of the testing requirements. That's for sure. You
Uh,
talked about
and
AI.
power-
Go ahead.
And even subtle things like, you guys had talked on the previous discussions about Bluetooth. The only way we found some of those Bluetooth issues, and Bluetooth in 2013, especially on Android phones, was the Wild West, is being able to do hundreds of automated test cycles to find all those variants and find the issues.
And by the way, I didn't realize that it was 10 to 20% of our engineering efforts was infrastructure. That puts it in perspective. I think there are very few hardware companies who get to that level of automation, but I think it worked well for us. And looking at AI, I think we're going to see those numbers go even higher in terms of infrastructure to engineer ratios. If you were writing the AI guidelines for the Pebble team today, if we were around in 2025 and you were in charge of figuring out our policy towards AI coding tools and AI infrastructure, what would it look like?
I would find bandwidth for some percentage. In fact, at the moment we have an intern working, and I said, spend 20% of your time over a week, whatever, looking at new tools, because the tooling cycle is changing so quickly, and there are sort of stepwise improvements in work cycle. Now, it is really difficult as an engineer because you're constantly having to retrain and relearn in order to be as productive as you can be.
I think
It's more accelerated
my career. I've had to learn new programming languages. I've had to learn new methods. I've had to learn new hardware. I've had to learn lots of new tools. I feel like if you plan to have a 50-year-long software engineering career, you're going to start from scratch every 10 years at least.
I think that the best advice some of the best advice I've gotten from a peer engineer is an amazingly smart guy who was at NVIDIA and done some really interesting things at Meta and elsewhere in his career, was not getting pedantic about particular tools or platforms or processes, right? Continually learn, in some ways improve yourself, but be adaptive. There are very few folks who can survive and being really engaged in a long-term career who pigeonhole themselves on one particular thing. I think the most interesting folks are folks who are open to moving, shifting their mindset, and just trying to learn new things. Most of us, when we started out, as kids, were building things with whatever resources we had around, and someone else gave us something else for our birthday, or we scavenged another something, and then we built something new, right? Continue that mindset forever.
So would you, if we were still around in 2025, would you equip everybody with Cursor and tell them, go nuts with AI, use it on all the pull requests, write as much AI code as you can? Would that be your clarion call?
So I think that the AI systems today have been trained on they've been trained on the data that's been available. And so they're good at certain things, they're not good at other things. So for what we're doing at Eagor, I've done a lot of Swift UI code, and AI tools have written me a lot of Swift UI code because I don't know the language very well. And also I've done a bunch of back-end code, some front-end. Front-end code, AI tools had a huge training set of data that was open source and can produce pretty good results. I think whether it's, in my example, UI-based mobile code or highly complex backend code where there are multiple processors, multiple systems, hitting databases asynchronously. It struggles in those two areas. And I think it's probably because of the lack of strong training sets. And my guess is that the same thing is also true in the firmware world as well. If you look at, again, channeling back to the previous discussions, which I'd encourage folks to listen to, you brought up that Pebble OS and WebOS, which is also a little involved and happen to be two of the only large-scale large-scale embedded projects that were open sourced.
Right.
And so I think that's a good example of where there hasn't been a lot of great training data. Most of the products that have been created either on the deeply embedded side, on the really good mobile side, or on the back-end side are proprietary. And so those code bases haven't been accessible. Even large companies like Google and Microsoft only have, frankly, a relatively limited training set of data there. That means, in my mind, at least until that changes, that in those three areas, there really are still needs for skilled developers, that having, Cursor or Claude or whatever system go and purely write code is probably not going to give you the result you want. Actually, the Anthropic team just put out a new white paper on sort of coding guidelines. And if you look in there, even they say, it's a collaborative effort with engineers, and they have access to, better tools and models than the outside world. Now, I do think there are ways where if the industry wanted that those capabilities could be improved, let's just say on the embedded side, right? What would it take? Well, there are great code bases out there. There are probably some not so great ones, but that's true on the web training data as well, the front-end training data. Whether I could anticipate there being some sort of consortiums, whether it's maybe national, some countries say, we want every line of embedded code in our country to be used to train the country-based model. Maybe it's consortiums. I could see, for example, chip manufacturers coming to their customers and saying, hey, we know you built these products. Would you, for training purposes, like license your code back to us so that we could have a model or something that integrates with the model? That means that when people code for our platform, AI can do a better job. Or it could even be an industry consortium. There would be benefits for developers to come together and say, hey, we each have decent sized code bases. In aggregate together, we can help train models that will make all of our lives better. It's not going to happen on its own because, again, a lot of these things are tied to products that make money. They're
Right.
not going to be, there's not a lot of impetus to open source them. So I think there are ways for that to break. Maybe it never breaks, and there's still proprietary code there that is not being used to train models, and that's still a gap, and that still requires engineers who are experts in those areas.
So it sounds like firmware engineers are okay. Firmware engineers will be relatively spared by AI automation for now, but solutions will be found eventually, and they should still probably get used to them, right? Chris,
I think the
Probably-
baseline assumption should be the models are both smarter and dumber than you think at any point in time.
Once all firmware development goes to Rust, there's more stuff out there. We'll see.
We're not going to open that can of worms just yet. So after Pebble, you've gone from Pebble to then building an organization at Intel and working on the Vaunt classes. You've now started your startup, Eagor, pure software, no hardware. What have you taken from the Pebble experience and chosen to do again, or maybe even do more of at Intel and Eagor? And what did you decide, what? This is something I'm going to do differently moving forwards. Is there any kind of key learnings that you would share and that you yourself had internalized from the Pebble days that you've carried forward to both of those places?
I think it depends on the environment that you're able to apply these rules in,
course.
right? Intel, I think one of the hardest things in engineering is trying to build a non-core product, be in sort of an innovation group at a large company. Because by definition, you're working on something that is not, whether this is a hardware or software product, you're working on something that is not the thing that's bringing in the money, that's paying everyone's salaries. And so this is true at any large company, and frankly, even outside engineering. And so I think as much as possible, trying to pull the best attributes out of a startup, meaning try and find areas where you can have as much autonomy as possible, understand where you don't. For example, in a big company, there are sort of market positioning, distribution, sales channels, things that frankly can't disrupt and may be seen as like advantages, but really figuring out what those are and what the boundaries are. Okay, we're working on this brand new thing. I'll take the Vaughn glasses at Intel as an example. These were augmented reality glasses that we publicly demoed, and we're signing up developers in 2017 before we got shut down in 2018. Sorry, I was trying to figure out the timeline there. And an equivalent to some of the AR glasses that are coming on the market today. So we were, and that was boosted by some of the capabilities that a large company had. They'd already made investments in 3 custom chips and a display processor that startup would not be able to do. You'd need a huge amount of money and time to get there. So figuring out the environment that you're in, and then what rules can you apply in that environment? Okay. And what do you have to do to create a structure, sometimes partitioning, getting back to, this is the case where partitioning can be good. And that sort of structure, partition your engineers away so that they could operate as much like a startup as possible. Give them as much freedom in tooling as possible. I see some companies that have legitimate questions around, for example, AI, which AI systems could be used, internally. On paper, at least all the first tier ones have plans where they will not train their models on your code, but also think about the downsides. Like if you're not allowing your engineers to race forward and be as productive as possible, someone else is probably going to pass you. I think from a startup perspective, you're very cognizant that someone else is probably working on a similar idea, and whoever displaces you, whether you're big or small, is not going to be doing the same thing as you. They're going to be doing something more innovative or faster or something different. And so that kind of gets back to knowing, being as adaptive as you can, knowing where you can adapt, whether it's within a big organization.
I guess.
Playing to your strengths, but
playing
also
to your strength. You were able to make investments that a startup wouldn't make, and so you made these investments. They were your moats, but at the same time, you accepted that you would never quite reach the same velocity.
You would reach some velocity in some areas. We were able to carve out of the software team where, frankly, we could operate in that way. And so I think carve out as much of that high velocity entrepreneurialism sort of organization as you can. Even in a large organization, it is really difficult because large organizations are successful for a reason, and they're good at something. It just may not be the thing that you're trying to work on or displace or augment with your new product. In a pure software startup, obviously you don't have the same constraints of having to synchronize with hardware. I think it's really key, no matter where you're working, to figure out where the revenue stream either is or is going to come from. Right. Is this going to be selling hardware, once a year or once every 2 years, and that's basically the primary revenue stream? Is this going to be selling hardware that is not as profitable on its own, but you have some subscription model or something else that's going to augment that? You really need to understand those dynamics because, and this, again, I think is something you're very aware of in a startup. It's harder to recognize always in a big company because there's so many things about your engineering organization are going to be reflective of what you need to do on the business side there. I think about release cadence. That is a decision that you made. We made a very particular decision at Pebble going to the 6-week release cadence for most features because we were trying to keep customer engagement, and the theory was that repeat customers, while we were early, repeat customers were going to be important as we went from the Pebble to the Pebble Steel to the Pebble Time. Certainly we needed to grow our market, but we didn't wanted to retain as many of those customers as we could because they were also our greatest evangelists. So I think one of the things, bringing from Pebble is being really thoughtful about what your release cadence was. That would not have worked, I think, for us had we continued on to be more successful because of marketing and the need to, it's hard to keep in people's minds every 6 weeks, oh, there's something new. It's easier to say once a year, here's something splash, or once every 6 months. So these things also have to change. I think taking from the Pebble days and the startup days, recognize where you are and recognize that not all of those aspects are going to need to or should stay the same as you grow, or even as the market evolves around you, even if you're not hitting that growth path.
Can you tell us a little bit about Eagor, what you're building now? And I'd be super curious to hear if there's anything from your hardware experience that you're taking. This is a software business. Is there anything you're taking with you from your hardware experience that's that's giving Eagor an edge or making you operate differently from your run-of-the-mill hardware startup?
So I guess I'll talk about what it is, and both on the product side as well as a bit on the engineering side, because that's your audience. People's lives are busy, and the average person gets 120, 150 emails a day. There's WhatsApp messages, calendar appointments. There's all of this stuff, and a lot of it is noise. A lot of it, you're really trying to find the signal from the noise. You're trying to find the important things, the things you have to do, the things you have to be aware of, things you have to follow up on. And so we're working on a tool to help manage that, not just for your professional life, but people actually have lives, believe it or not, although a lot of folks here may be in startups, but people have lives outside work as well. And so to create a holistic tool that can help you manage those information streams, surface the important things, and really focus on getting the tasks that come out of those done, actionable tasks. And so I haven't looked at my inbox. I haven't manually looked at my inboxes for my emails in about 6 months since we started getting prototypes for this. So the surface for this product is an app, initially an iOS app. We're signing people up to the wait list now. And basically through that app, you're able to see, frankly, kind of the best stuff. And we were only able to build this product now because even just a few years ago, the systems, the AI systems that help distill out what is important and understand enough about the user to be able to get that right, they didn't exist and they weren't capable enough. We're working hard at that, working at bringing that out to market. Those of you who are interested, if you go on to Eagor, EAGOR.ai/waitlist, you can sign up to be notified when it's going to come out. And on the technical side, that again, I've been writing a huge amount of code with help from AI. It's been very interesting, again, with respect to understanding what these tools can do today and what they can't. The pace of development in those tools it's amazing, it's frustrating, it's impressive.
I think it's been best for mobile development. Like what's it's been most helpful today?
So we've got two front ends, a back end, and a mobile system. On the front end stuff, you can give it, if you've got a small to medium sized code base, you can give it, fairly good instructions and it'll do a pretty decent job. Not on the UI stuff. Frankly, I haven't found any of these systems to be great at being able to give an image from design and say, lay it out like this. It never lays it out like that. But on sort of medium sized code bases, business logic, there are limitations with respect to complexity of the code base where things, the context windows are not large enough. It just can't remember enough to actually get complex tasks done. But I've been able to get very, very far on writing our Swift app with, frankly, having very little context in Swift, but I know how to design software programs. I know when, we need to look at different data management systems and conceptually like how to guide it. It's okay, well, this is too slow. Think about caching this. Let's redesign these data structures. So it's interesting. And I think getting back to, one of your earlier questions about how would you sort of redesign a software team differently today? There are certain things where these tools are not highly capable today, or maybe they're good at exploratory work, or maybe they're good at some level of code review, but not really doing the work in the middle. Recognize those boundaries. Those boundaries will collapse. I like to say in 50 years' time, can you imagine anyone writing a line of code? I think the answer is probably no. As much as we enjoy the process.
Except for the one guy who still writes COBOL on a government mainframe.
Because they're passionate, but not necessarily because it's required to get the job
as a
done.
craft. Yes, as a craft, 100%.
As an art. In 20 years' time, I don't know what the answer is, right? In 5 years' time, at some point, there's a break there, and it's different for different types of code. I think we definitely saw this on web front end. There was an inflection point, when tooling got better, from the point where barely anyone could design a web page to like everybody could. Now, everybody, in quotes, can design a front-end system more than just a web page. So I think those bars are changing. So yeah, I think there's it's such a dynamic environment. When I started writing embedded code, my first job was working on a system with 4K of flash, which was UV erasable, so it's like a 30-minute cycle time, and 200 bytes of RAM. And we were using data sheets because the internet existed. I'm not that old. Technical data was not on them, and these were still bound proprietary books that someone at Intel or Texas Instruments would try and claim back at some point. First transition was actually that information moving to the web, and then second transition, I think, was Stack Overflow and having a community of developers who could share information and accelerate and answer each other's questions. And I think, to me, this is kind of the fourth wave of AI augmented code development.
We have just a few minutes left, so I want to get to our Q&A question. We have one question this time from Cal Cochran, who asks, I would be curious to hear what the biggest non-technical thing you looked for in candidates at Pebble was. For example, was it the humility, ability to work with others, and how did you interview for those things? Because we talked about matrix,
Yep.
finding ones and zeros in 2D matrices, but that doesn't tell you anything about the soft skills, if we can call them that.
Sure. So I'll bring up one. Maybe I'll be able to stop at one. First one is going to be passion, and passion for building things. And I think this is actually where, again, these tools today make it easier to demonstrate. But has someone got, whether they have a passion project and they have something open source or not, maybe it's something they worked on commercially, maybe it's something they did as a school project. Can they describe it? Can they talk about it? Did they care about it? Did they not just need to get it done, but they were really excited about getting it done and the process of getting it done? Because I think that passion for getting something technical done, for building, and usually it's building something, drives a lot. If you're passionate
100%.
about something, you're likely to collaborate with folks a lot better. You really want to achieve the outcome. If you're trying to think about, okay, how do you build a cross-disciplinary team, firmware, hardware, support, different software disciplines, if everybody's passionate about what they're doing and achieving the outcome, it's going to be so much easier than if you have folks who are dialing it in. So I think that is the key thing. And that's also why we were didn't constrain ourselves to just looking at folks from high-end schools or whatever, but if you could show that you were passionate about something, and again, it could have just been something
Having built a Pebble app, built a Pebble app was a great signal.
It was a great signal. I think also we recognize that sometimes people have other things in their lives and they don't have time to do passion projects, so it could be something at work, but you have to be able to convey that. That's really hard in a resume. I admit that. And so you've got to figure out some way of breaking through and showing that passion for what you're doing.
I remember when we interviewed this engineer, one of them, when I think about passion, there's a few people that really stand out. Again, I won't name for their own privacy, but I remember interviewing this engineer who worked in avionics somewhere in the north. And, he had strengths and weaknesses for sure. But one of the things that was clear was the level of passion. When he talked about some of the projects, we're talking about very kind of complex, old school avionics systems for, light aircraft. He really had a sparkle in his eye, and the passion was infectious. And working with people like that really uplifts you. And in an interview process, all you need to do is ask them a few leading questions into the kind of projects they worked on, and a really passionate person just runs with it, right? I think that's a really good insight. Awesome. All right. Unfortunately, we're at time. I think we could have talked for 3 hours. We barely scratched the surface of the agenda. As always, really, really great to see you. Thank you so much for your insights. We're very excited. I'm signed up for the Eagor waitlists. Promising me I'll never have to look at my email again is the best pitch you could ever give me. I wish it was only 150 emails per day that I received. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Ken. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And thank you to all of you who listened today and participated. I hope everybody has an amazing rest of your day. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this Coredump session. If you enjoyed the conversation and want to dig deeper, check out more episodes available wherever you get your podcasts, on YouTube or at memfault.com/webinars. If you have any questions for our team, drop us a line at team@memfault.com. Until then, keep shipping. See you next time.